Our next speaker will talk about the importance of GDPR. After its implementation, the impact of this change in data privacy regulation took a big part in digital industry. What are the advices and practical directions to follow GDPR in the future, and much more, will be revealed in the speech delivered by Aleksandar Ugljavarevic. Please welcome him with an applause.
Thank you. My name is Aleksandar Ugljavarevic. I'm attorney at law, focusing on digital and IT sector. I'm here in front of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. You probably heard of it. It's the organization that empowers media, brands, advertising agencies in thriving digital economy. I have more than 10 years of experience in advising and consulting different various large companies, tech companies, digital companies, also startups. But also I have experience working in an EU institution. So that, the reason why I'm saying about EU institution is that EU is trying to regulate the digital area within Europe and within the entire world. So if you're in digital sector, you need to follow the EU because through its platform, Digital Single Market, it wants to uniform the regulation. It's done through GDPR. It's also done through regulation of blockchain in the future, and also a new copyright regulation. So many things are approaching. EU is pioneer in that sector, so follow EU in that course. Today's topic is more specific data. It's personal data, the protection of personal data. And according to GDPR, personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. That can be, you know, your name, your last name, can be email address, but also it can be UD number, MAC address, IP address, so any really digital or any other data that can identify you as a person. What happened after May of 25th? You probably heard about GDPR so many times. Even GDPR was at 25th of May more searchable a word than Beyonce. You know, that's really something really interesting. So what happened after 25th of May? Many were talking that internet will stop, that the flow of data, personal data will stop, but that didn't happen. Actually, what happened on 25th of May, that we received so many new emails about companies providing some new privacy notice, privacy policies, getting reconsented. It was just big spam. Before we move to exact specific examples of GDPR application, I would like once again to emphasize the importance of the extraterritorial application of GDPR. GDPR and EU desires to have the application of GDPR not just in EU but all across the globe. Last year, here on this conference, we were talking about the main principles of GDPR, the data subject rights, all the basic things about GDPR, so I will not go through that. I will go more deep in more practical examples. So the GDPR says that it applies firstly on the companies established in EU. Since we are not in EU, how we are impacted by GDPR? The other article of the GDPR said that it also applies to the companies outside of EU if their processing activities are related to the offering of goods and services to the data subjects in EU or monitors behavior of data subjects in EU. This is related to tracking, profiling, and other techniques. So GDPR wants to be applied all over the world, and the practice showed us that the companies follow that trend. We can put that example previous on this conference, whether GDPR applies to this conference and its website. This conference clearly provides some services, right? It provides services of education, presentations, seminars. So if you go to the website of Data Science Conference, you will see that language of that website is English language. And EU, through GDPR, provided several indicators how is going to be GDPR applied around the globe, not just on the companies within EU. And one of these indicators is, of course, the language of the website. So the English language of the website is internationally recognized. It's not just strict for the EU, so this does not trigger the application of GDPR. But if you go more deeper in the website, you will see that the payment is designated in euro. The tickets are designated in euros, 350 euros, and euro is the official currency only in Europe. So this triggers actually the application of GDPR because the conference, the website, actually points to the citizens in EU, actually the data subjects in EU. The GDPR actually protects the territory of European Union. It does not protect the citizens of EU, and that's really important notion. It's not related to the citizens of EU, but the territory of EU. So if you're in EU and you have some residents there, you are protected by GDPR. That's really important. So beside that, even if you are not under scrutiny of GDPR, now the impact of GDPR is so big that it is becoming golden standard. The countries all over the world, such as India, Brazil, are adopting new laws that are really connected to GDPR, almost based on GDPR. Even California, you know that in United States, every state within United States has its own legislation. California and New Jersey are adopting new laws that are really in accordance with GDPR. So even if you're not falling under GDPR, you need to follow all these basic principles of GDPR because it's probably becoming golden standard. Now, you probably heard about the big sanctions of GDPR, up to 20 million euros or 4% of annual global revenue turnover, which is in case, let's say, Deutsche Telekom around $5 billion. That's really large sum. But GDPR is not about sanction. That's not the priority of the protection of privacy and security. And this is the example of the CNIL, Commission Nationale de l'Informatique et de la Liberté. That is a supervisory authority of France. So each EU country has its own supervisory authority that supervises the application of GDPR. And this is French authority who issued an opinion about the sanctions and about the enforcement of sanctions. So it will approach two-tier approach. Regarding fundamental principles such as lawfulness of processing, security of data, retention period, it will stay on that course that these principles must be applied rigorously. So there will be no excuses. But regarding new obligations and rights under GDPR, such as data portability, impact assessment, data protection impact assessment, the focus of this supervision authority will be to educate the companies and the businesses. It's not going to be just to sanction that company, but rather to educate about the new rights and obligations. Also, the French authority said that in first months that followed the GDPR entry into force, if an organization is acting in good faith and shows that engaged all its resources to comply with GDPR, the French authority and other authorities will not sanction that company. That it's not the primary goal. And that's really important thing. So if you are under scrutiny of GDPR or want to comply with it, make some assessment about your readiness, how you're ready with GDPR, and make some roadmap. 100% compliance with GDPR is almost impossible. Everybody say that. But if you have that roadmap and you prioritize some things around that, that is going to be at the moment enough to comply with GDPR, actually not to be under scrutiny of sanctions. On other tail of GDPR is reputation. And according to my opinion, this is much more important than sanctions and enforcement. You can see that in the case of Facebook, I don't know if you follow that, but Facebook shares dropped nearly 20% in late July. And they lost more than 100 billion in value. That is the biggest loss in value of stock company in the history of stock exchange. And the biggest reason for that, of the Facebook, was because of privacy and security issues, because of GDPR. There was the case Cambridge Analytica, firstly. Then Zuckerberg went to Supreme Court, then he went to US Senate, he went to European Commission, and he needed to explain how the Facebook was dealing with data, with personal data, and he was not really 100% sure that the Facebook has proper security, and that's why the shares dropped. The latest survey showed that almost 84% of consumers look at the security history of company and track records of protecting personal information. And this is something that consumers are looking at the moment when they are selecting some company to buy either services or some products. 54% of consumers believe companies may have misused their data in the past, and 73% of consumers want to understand more about how their data is used. The GDPR actually started this wave of concerns with the consumers, how they look at the privacy and security. And every company needs to take care of that. We are here at the data science conference, but personal data, according to GDPR and almost now every law, it's really, really broad. It's not just name, last name, passport number, but it goes really, really further from that. I was talking that I'm in front here of Interactive Advertising Bureau, so I'm going to focus a little bit on advertising and how GDPR affects advertising industry. We were talking also about Facebook. Facebook claims that it is really digital company, but we saw that Zuckerberg said that their basic revenue is based on advertising. So we can say that Facebook is actually really digital advertising company and not digital company. Regarding that, there are a couple of matters like direct marketing that is really affected by GDPR. So we said previously that on 25th of May we received so many emails informing about companies that there is new privacy notice, there is consent, but so many companies lost their consumers because of that, because not many people actually answer to these emails answering that they consent to further processing of data. So what could companies use instead of getting consent? In business to consumers relations, there is notion of soft opt-in. You know that GDPR provides obligation of active opt-in. Everybody needs to actively put the mark that he agrees that the company or some organization process personal data. Soft opt-in can be used in relation when company obtains the contact of that consumer in relation in some course of sale of goods or services. So if you have some previous relation with some consumer and you want to market some similar product to that, you can use soft opt-in, so no need to get consent. But at the end of that newsletter, you always need to provide to that person option to opt out from that. So that's the most important. So there is no opt-in, but opt-out. You need to clearly provide that. In business to business relation, when you're sending some newsletters to companies, representatives, you can use mostly legitimate interest. And this is something that is assured by ICO, which is Supervisory Authority of UK. They said that if you're sending some newsletters to the company's employees on their business emails, you can use legitimate interest. You don't need to get consent. Okay, now we move to cookies, tracking, and targeting. This is some new techniques. Well, not to everyone is new technique. I really admire the guy who invented the name cookie. It it really looks, and sounds really nice. But this technique is really, it's really in detail. It really goes deeply into the processing of personal data. According to GDPR, cookie is personal data. I'm not sure if you know what is cookie, but cookie is a file that a website asks your browser to put on your browser, small file, and follows your all interaction with your browser. So if there is some cookie on your website, it follows all your interaction with the internet. It tracks all your behavior. It remembers whatever you've done. Next time you go to that website picks up all your data and sells to some companies, advertising companies, and they're sending you some targeting advertising. Like if you're, I don't know, want to go to Spain, and you're looking for hotels in Spain, you're looking for rent-a-car in Spain. When you're in Spain, they cross geolocation and your cookie, and they're sending you advertising regarding these rent-a-cars or hotels in Spain. So you probably know that because you have it on mobile phones, but this is cookie. So what is the purpose of the cookie? Identify users, remember users' custom preferences. So if you're on a website, cookie remembers mostly your name and your last name, so you don't need to put it once again. Help users complete tasks without having to re-enter information. And also, it targets advertising. GDPR, as I already mentioned, says that cookie, it is personal data. So we need to take into consideration that before we put in cookie on website, we need to provide privacy notice to all the consumers about the cookie, what it's doing that cookie, and where the cookie sends that personal data. And you need to agree to that. Consent is mandatory for almost every cookie, especially for advertising cookies. I checked on 25th of May, most media in Europe, biggest media, and most of these companies, medias, they didn't have the proper privacy notice in accordance with GDPR. It's new technology, but supervisory authorities are following that. They have proper engineers, and they're looking, of course, for these applications. But there are some cookies, of course, that are, well, let's say that they enhance technology, they easy our use of websites. So some cookies are exempted from the consent, from need to get consent. This is, let's say, user input cookie, session ID cookie. That's a cookie when you are buying something online, you put something in your cart, and that cookie remembers what's in your cart. That is necessary for that website. Also, authentication cookies, content player cookies, media content, if you're somewhere, SoundCloud or some other provider, it remembers what you have done. So these cookies are exempted from the necessity of getting consent. Once again, we come back to the CNIL, that's French Supervisory Authority, which already did some inspections about the cookies and about targeting, about advertising. So it controlled two companies, two apps, which use technology to collect personal data through cookies, through geolocation, and they carry out advertising campaigns on mobile phones. This app collects data from smartphone even when the app is not turned on. And this technology is called SDK, they called it SDK, and makes it possible to collect the advertising ID of the smartphone and the geolocation data of the people approximately every 5 minutes. So this data is collected and sent to the app provider, and then these data are then crossed with the points of interest determined by the partners, store signs, and they can display targeted advertising on people's smartphones from the places they visited. So it's a mix of cookies, geolocation, they're sending you just targeted advertising. The question of the CNIL was whether this application provides all the necessary requirements that GDPR asks, whether there was consent, whether there was proper privacy notice. Of course not. You were just downloading the app on the App Store without consent, without privacy notice explaining what's the purpose of the processing of data, what's the retention period, what is the technology SDK, whether you consented to that you want to get the advertising proper to you. And also what was really interesting that this app could not be downloaded without this technology. So, as already mentioned, it's not about the sanctions, GDPR. This is not the sanction. It's the last resort of GDPR. The French authority sent notice to these apps to comply with GDPR. They go through all this that we mentioned in more details, and they told them you need to change this, and that in order to comply with GDPR. If you don't do that, in 3 months you will be sanctioned. So it's not just once the breach happened, the GDPR apply its sanction. It's not the case. And finally, we're going to talk about the ePrivacy regulation. I'm not sure if you heard of it, but GDPR is some kind of umbrella regulation regarding personal data in Europe. It provides regulation about personal data in a general way. ePrivacy regulation is more specific, and it's draft phase. The EPR, it's the abbreviation of ePrivacy regulation, focuses on confidentiality of users' electronic communication, and it's related directly to direct marketing, website audience measurement, transmission of communication across devices and browsers, and cookies set on users' machine. Draft of privacy regulation is subject to many arguments and many fights in Brussels because of the big lobby group, of course. GDPR went through, everybody is okay now with GDPR, but ePrivacy regulation goes much deeper in the advertising industry. And they say that advertising industry just in Europe is around 600 billion euros, which is really big sum. So the ePrivacy regulation wants to particularize and complement the provisions of GDPR. It was planned that the ePrivacy regulation to be adopted on the 1st January of 2008 so that it could be applied same as GDPR, but because of the lobby group, it is postponed. It is expected to be adopted in 2019, but we will see. So what this draft says that consent is the only lawful basis for processing. There is no legitimate interest, and this is something that most of course brands, advertising companies, they want to go against that, but EU is really strong on that. Now latest changes of the ePrivacy regulation delete one article which said that software providers, and they mentioned web browsers, of course, they were obliged to inform the end user every time privacy settings are updated. What is the implication of that rule is that, let's say Google Chrome, if you install it, it will ask you about the cookie setting every time it is changed. And of course, web browsers didn't want to accept that. They were fighting against it, of course, because it is their responsibility, not the responsibility of website. They changed that, so now the responsibility of cookies is to ad tech providers or websites. Okay, so far it's been 4 months since application of GDPR. It's not that long. There is, of course, some practice, as I mentioned, but it will probably come much more. We expect sanctions and more comments and suggestions in following months, but at the moment the focus is really on educating people, educating firstly consumers, because it's about protecting personal data. I'm going to mention a little bit how is the situation in Serbia. The draft of our law, which they are saying that is in accordance with GDPR, which is more or less copy-paste of GDPR, is under stay. We don't know what is going to happen. and who have interest to be in this situation. Thank you. If you have some questions regarding GDPR, whatever, some definitions or my presentations, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, we have first question.
Hello, thanks for the great presentation. I have actually a lot of questions, so if I will just give the mic everyone else.
You can ask me afterwards, we can talk.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I have then like two that I think are like outstanding. So like one is, can I process data from my client's users? So for example, I'm doing some development for my client, and as such, the data is on my servers, and I would like to process it. And if I anonymize it, well, is this okay? So then I can come back to the client and tell them, hey, I found a great way to help you to boost your services more. So not for my personal use, but for them.
Okay, so in that situation, you're a processor. You're not controller. You're not controlling what data, personal data to be processed. You need to have contract that's mandatory under GDPR. Of course, you can process, but this obligation of agreement is on the controller, on your client. You can process that. Anonymization of the personal data, it is actually recommended by GDPR, and anonymized personal data is not under scrutiny of GDPR. But the thing is that if your anonymized data is just you anonymize it, but your client can actually have that personal data, then in that chain, entire chain, the GDPR looks entire chain, it's not anonymized. So that's the thing, because the GDPR looks at the entire chain, client, you, whichever in that chain subject is.
Thank you. And the second question is, how do I prove that somebody gave me a consent? Because I can always rig my database and say, oh, that email said, yes, feel free to do whatever you want.
There are softwares now that provide OneTrust. There are a lot of softwares now that they're saving your log about the consent. They have consent management system. So that's how it's done. Through softwares, through logs, that's how you prove that you get consent. And this is really important because consent, you need to have that base of all these consents.
And so to clarify, just because I have this implemented on my website that I do disable all the cookies in case they say no, or they can even opt out, etc., that this is still not enough. I should actually use some of these consent managers.
Yes, if you're using some cookies, some cookie management, but I mean, I'm also a consultant, so I'm telling you that to be 100% GDPR compliant. But you need to look at your competition. That's the most important thing. If the competition is not following that, you need to be prepared for that. But when the sanctions come, you need to apply that.
Thank you very much.
This is really important because, I mean, if you want to be 100% compliant at this moment, the business will just kill you, you know.
Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome.
Hello, I'm George Krivokapic from Faculty of Organizational Sciences. I just want to express gratitude to Aleksandar for a great presentation and invite you all for another presentation on GDPR at 4:10, which will focus more on data mining and big data analytics in general. So I'm focused on these aspects, so it would be great if you can join, and we will just continue on more complex issues.
Yes, George is my colleague from law faculty from far away, yes.
Do we have a question? Somebody?
Now it's really good opportunity to ask whatever you think of GDPR, because there is a lot of information about it, but most of these informations are not either practical or they're not true, you know. There's like a lot of fame about it, but there are not many experts really that talk about that.
You mentioned the 3-month period, the notice and things like that. Is that always enforced, or is it up to the country and to the courts? Do they enforce it immediately or not? Or
This is not the rule. This is not the rule. This is really practice of each supervisory authority. Let's say we were talking, if there is some really big breach, if you don't have consent and you're processing your personal data, you'll get much less notice. But it really depends on the situation, on the breach, on how you deal with data.
So for example, if one company, okay, let's say it's like a trade war or something, and you want to like prevent the company from the other country to process data, but you don't want to prevent your data, can the law like be misused and then like enforce the GDPR immediately for the company from the other country, and for your country you give them a notice, and then they have like unfair advantage?
Yeah, I mean, probably it won't happen, but I mean still, because EU is 30 countries, and there's going to be 30 supervisory authorities, you know, it's really spread. But the main thing is that they will give you some notice. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, it's going to be some time for you to comply with that. You will have 3 months is just enough, you know, and they will give you directions how to deal with it. So it's not going to be like you breached some GDPR and they immediately give you sanction. It's not going to be like that. They will give you some notice. They want to educate you. Probably in next 1 or 2 years, maybe 3. And they said after that it's going to be probably much stricter. So this is like some period, you know, how to...
So, but the period is not like clear, it's up to the case by case basis.
It's not clear, it's not clear. I mean, GDPR is not 100% clear in that manner that you just need to follow it and you're going to be compliant. It's really up to the company, because GDPR applies to hairdress salon, also applies to big banks, applies to some tech companies, you know, and GDPR is umbrella regulation for all of these companies, you know, so it really depends. But there are some basic principles that must be applied within GDPR.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.